All right, well, good morning or afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, FAQs, Sexual Assault, Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, and Stalking. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Associate Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center, and joining me today is my colleague, Laura Egan. So I just want to give her a moment to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Abby. Hi, everyone. As Abby said, I'm Laura. I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the Clery Center, and I'm so glad to join you for another one of our FAQs webinars. We have found them to be really well received, and we're always excited to present them. We really enjoy the interactive format of them, so thank you for taking some time out of your day and your month for this webinar today.
Great. And then we also have our colleagues, Amy and Megan, who are going to be the producers for today's webinar, and they'll work with you if you have any tech-related questions throughout the session. I'm first just going to review a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As Laura mentioned, this webinar really is intended to be interactive. We're going to ask some questions of you, ask your perspectives on certain things, and certainly we wanted to create a space in which you can ask questions as well. So we encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments using the questions tab in your control panel, and we'll show an example of what that looks like in just a moment so that you can see that before we use that section. We are also planning to record today's webinar, and it will be provided to you in next week's National Campus Safety Awareness Month email. Before we move into additional content, we just wanted to share a little bit about our work here at the Clery Center. We know a lot of you have been attending all of our webinars, so you're very familiar with our work. The Clery Center was founded by Connie and Howard Clery, whose daughter Jeanne was killed on her own college campus. And a lot of our work here at the Clery Center is really honoring that history, the Clery's vision of wanting to create safer campuses for other students as well, and really figuring out how can we work together with college and university communities to create those safer campuses. And so we appreciate not only during National Campus Safety Awareness Month, but all year long, how many opportunities we get to partner and spend time with you all and really figure out how can we find solutions to some of the challenges or the problems that you might be seeing or experiencing within your community. We have a number of different initiatives here at the Clery Center. Our collaborative program, a learning membership program in which teams of individuals work together to revise or revisit their policies, procedures, make sure that the practices on campus are really aligned with their future or what they would like to see in terms of campus safety, as well as other training and learning opportunities. So if you've participated in these webinars and you think that additional resources might be useful or helpful, remember that our website has that information all year long. For the past few years, the Clery Center has used National Campus Safety Awareness Month as an opportunity to respond to key questions and requests that we're hearing in the field by creating professional development programs and resources that you can participate in throughout the month or access through our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website after the fact. So we'll mention some of those free resources that we developed as we're talking about some of these different items during today's webinars. But if you haven't had the chance to sign up to participate in this year's campaign, you can do so by clicking on the link in the control panel, and that will ensure that you can access the webinar recording when it's emailed to you. We know that September is a very busy time for all of you, so that's an opportunity to really go back and revisit if there were earlier learning opportunities that you didn't get the chance to participate in. And then we're not going to spend too much time on the Clery Act overview because a lot of our focus today is certainly going to be diving into specific areas. But as you know, at the end of this week marks the deadline for putting out annual security reports to our campus community. And that really is the Cliff Notes, a picture of the campus safety and security policies that you have on your campus, as well as specific campus crime statistics. Our webinar today is going to focus on elements within the most recent amendments to the Clery Act, the Violence Against Women Act amendments to Clery, which expanded rights and options for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. In addition to that, there are also ongoing disclosures within the Clery Act. So a lot of times individuals might think that the Clery Act and Clery Act responsibilities are an annual thing, whereas we know that all of you are spending a lot of time day to day really considering what information do we need to share with our campus community and how do we implement some of these requirements on a day-to-day basis, such as those we're going to talk about today, the rights and resources and options for survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And lastly, the Department of Education enforces the Clery Act, so we'll certainly be sharing our contact information. We can help and support and answer questions throughout the year, but we may also reference areas or situations in which more feedback or guidance from the Department of Education might be useful. So as you'll see in terms of some of those key players and resources that we might reference throughout our time today, the Department of Education Clery Act compliance team enforces the Clery Act. WESTAT is a federal contractor that contracts with the Department of Education. That they run a help desk on behalf of the department, as well as are responsible for facilitating the submission of statistics that you are sharing with the Department of Education. And then in terms of resources, we might refer to the Clery Act statute and regulations, which is really the foundation for the work that we're doing, those base requirements that we're expected to fulfill at colleges and universities, as well as the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, sub-regulatory guidance that really expands on all of these different rights and requirements so that you have a sense of what the Department of Education expects or is looking for as they analyze or do program reviews at colleges and universities. And then last but not least, we may reference some program review findings. We do so not to create any fear around program reviews, but rather to use it as a source of information, things that and patterns that we might see at colleges and universities, and as a tool for exploring solutions to some of those challenges. As we mentioned, we're going to be asking you to share some thoughts using the questions pane. So you'll notice an image on the screen that looks a lot like the control panel that you should have in front of you. So anytime we're posing a question to all of you, we'd appreciate if you give your feedback using that questions tab, as well as using that space. You're welcome to use that space if you have questions throughout the webinar. We're going to be integrating into the webinar today some of the questions that were submitted to us ahead of time, but we also, we know that from earlier webinars so far this year, we've had a lot of individuals really interested and engaged and asking a lot of questions. So we will make sure that we cover our existing content within the hour, but Laura and I also plan to stay on a little bit longer if there are still questions coming in. We know that we had over 900 registrants for this particular webinar, so we may not get to everything, but we will certainly do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And that kind of brings me to this last slide before I hand it over to Laura, which is why did we do these Clery Webinar Wednesdays? And the reason that we decided on this particular solution is because we know that there are a number of challenges, questions, things that we're hearing as we work across the country. And we wanted to create a space during National Campus Safety Awareness Month where you could easily ask some of the questions that you might have, learn from peers as they're sharing their own feedback or their own information, and certainly have that additional space for questions today during today's webinar, and then certainly we hope you'll feel comfortable reaching out to us after the webinar as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura, who's going to talk a little bit about our goals for today's session.
Thanks so much, Abby. Yes, so today we are hoping to provide another general overview of the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act. We've kind of talked about some of the provisions that have come in place as a result of the VAWA amendments through our previous webinars, but we'll really be focusing in on those today, and really not only providing the general overview, but getting down deep into some of the frequently asked questions we receive from institutions around those amendments and what they mean in terms of implementation on your campus. Which brings me to our second objective, how we're going to be addressing some implementation concerns around primary prevention programming and awareness programming. We'll talk about implementing response procedures as we get a lot of questions around best practices or promising practices in that area. And then we'll explore some common questions that we receive around the disciplinary proceedings requirements as they are required under the VAWA amendments. So Abby, if you could just advance the slide, that would be great. Thank you so much. So first, we're just going to touch on the JEANNE Clery Act in an overview format. We have provided this information in previous webinars, so if we don't go into enough detail for you today, we really do encourage you to take a look at the previous webinars we've conducted this month that are all available through our YouTube channel for free. But basically, the JEANNE Clery Act really does focus on Clery crimes that occur within Clery geography. So a helpful first step is understanding what Clery geography means. Clery geography references on-campus property, which includes your student housing that is in your on-campus property. public property, which is public property that runs within or immediately adjacent to your on-campus or your core campus. And then your non-campus property, which is buildings that you own or control that are not reasonably contiguous to your on-campus or core campus property. So the reason these are listed in this order also is because it is really helpful for you to start with determining what your campus is, what your on-campus core campus is as defined under the Clery Act. From that, you can helpfully determine what your public property is, and then you can determine what your non-campus property is once you know what your core campus is. Overall, then, are the four Clery crime categories as defined and bucketed into these four categories by the recently updated handbook that is published by the Department of Education are your criminal offenses, then hate crimes, the VAWA offenses, and then arrests and referrals for disciplinary action. We're going to go into a little bit greater detail in each of those areas. On your screen right now is a list of the criminal offenses. You'll notice that sex offenses are now known as rape, fondling, incest, and statutory rape, which is also how sexual assault is defined under the Clery Act, and that is because of updates through the FBI's UCR and also through the VAWA amendments to the Clery Act. Abby, if you want to just advance to the next slide. When we say VAWA offenses, we are referring to dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. I know one of our questions was about talking about distinctions between dating violence and domestic violence, so we just wanted to clarify that dating violence is violence, well, I should say also as just a precursor, for domestic violence and dating violence, we are really only talking about physical abuse or sexual abuse or the threat of physical or sexual abuse. We are not talking about emotional or psychological abuse. That is in terms of counting or classifying crimes as domestic violence or dating violence under Clery. That was a specific caveat that came up through the negotiated rulemaking for the VAWA amendments to Clery, but it is clear that emotional and psychological abuse are not included within those definitions. Dating violence is violence that occurs between two individuals or more individuals that are part of a social or intimate relationship that would not necessarily fall under the definitions of domestic violence. However, domestic violence as defined by the Clery Act includes however your state defines partnerships that would be covered under domestic violence. So it defers to state definitions. And so that would not just be people that share a home together or are legally bound or share children together, but also anybody else that would be captured under your state's definition of domestic violence. So in some cases that would include roommates. And so the department's guidance with that is that if in your state you do include roommates within your domestic violence definition, you are welcome to include those types of crimes under your domestic violence category, but you do not have to, because that was never the intention of the department's inclusion of domestic violence in the VAWA amendments and in the Clery Act. So
and we'll break that down a little bit more in a later slide to hopefully add some additional clarification for those of you who might be questioning kind of that roommates angle.
Yes, yes. And we also want to reiterate how whatever you do choose to do in that way, as long as you are consistent with applying that guidance and you're documenting your decision making around that, then you are in a compliant state with that. But as Abby said, we'll get into that in later slides in a little bit more greater detail. So you can feel free to advance again, Abby. Thank you. Hate crimes are any of the criminal offenses that were on the slides 2 slides ago, plus these following crimes of larceny, theft, simple assault, intimidation, or destruction, damage, or vandalism of property, when those crimes are influenced by or are caused as a result of a bias in one of the bias categories. Part of the VAWA amendments to Clery was the inclusion of gender identity as a bias category and the separation out of ethnicity and national origin as bias categories. And we'll review that in a couple of slides again as well. And then when we talk about arrests and referrals for disciplinary action, we are talking about arrests for weapons law violations, drug law violations, or liquor law violations. And for disciplinary action referrals, we are talking about any referrals that are also violations of state or local law for weapons law violations, drug law violations, or liquor law violations. The VAWA amendments to Clery provided some new facets that are included or captured under these primary 4 categories here, and we just wanted to touch on those and explore them a little bit, as the questions that we are going to be sharing with you throughout the webinar today are focused in one of these 4 areas. So first, what the VAWA amendments provided was the newly included offenses of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, in addition to the new bias category of gender identity, and then the separating out of national origin and ethnicity as their own bias categories when it comes to classifying hate crimes. So we'll address a couple of questions that fall under that area. Additionally, the VAWA amendments extended a lot of the requirements that were previously in place due to the Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights for victims of sexual to victims of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So there were some requirements added under how to report those crimes and what information institutions are required to provide to all students and employees about reporting options, as well as to victims when they specifically come forward about their reporting options as well, in addition to how we are ensuring that you are notifying victims and all students that any publicly available record keeping in regards to Clery does not contain any personally identifying information. So that would be your timely warnings, that would be your daily crime log, and that would all kind of fall under this category of reporting. So we'll be answering some questions under that category. And then again, the VAWA amendments extended to the victims of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking some rights and requirements that were previously afforded to the victims of sexual assault, but we also expanded a lot of those requirements in general around prevention and response programming and procedures in place on a campus to both work towards the prevention of these crimes and how to appropriately respond to these crimes. And so in general, you are required to provide primary prevention and awareness programs to all incoming students and new employees that cover certain facets of talking about what the definitions of those crimes are in your state, and as well as what the definition of consent is in your state. These programs are required to include information about how your institution prohibits these crimes, and how your institution responds to reports of these crimes, and how you support victims of these crimes. And that includes a range of requirements from how you share with victims the importance of preserving evidence in order to obtain a protection order, through what accommodations are available for them and how they can request them, all the way through what written information you provide, and how folks can expect to move through a complaint process on campus for disciplinary proceedings, and also how they can pursue a criminal or law enforcement response as well. And then lastly, disciplinary proceedings are, you're required to include information in your annual security report and in your policies on campus around how you conduct disciplinary proceedings for the victims of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, both for students and employees. So we'll talk through some questions that we commonly receive in that area as well. And then lastly, we would be remiss if we talked about the VAWA amendments to Clery and did not talk about Title IX briefly. The intention really was to kind of catch the Clery Act up with Title IX in having these VAWA amendments in place. And oftentimes the Clery Act and Title IX are saying the same thing, just using different language. So we wanted to include this information here to just kind of draw down what those similarities are and what those different terms are. We're not going to get into the similarities and differences in great detail today, but we wanted to just acknowledge the intersections that are present. For example, the reporting authority under the Clery Act is known as a campus security authority. Under Title IX, they are known as responsible employees. The most important person on your campus in terms of these two systems being able to talk to each other well is your Title IX coordinator, as that individual is also a campus security authority. But whereas campus security authorities are required to report information that does not necessarily have to include personally identifiable information, responsible employees do need to include personally identifiable information or all information that they know, but for a much narrower focus. So your campus security authorities are reporting on all crimes that they are aware of that could, fall under the Clery Act, although they are not required to make that determination. So we really train CSAs to report all information on crimes that comes forward. Responsible employees are just responsible for sharing information as it relates to sexual harassment, which would include sexual violence. And then lastly, both the Clery Act and Title IX call for accommodations or measures to be put in place for victims of these crimes upon their request. The Clery Act calls them accommodations and Title IX calls them interim measures. And they both specify the areas in which these pieces should be provided. And then the Clery Act and Title IX both have requirements around the type of disciplinary procedures or on-campus grievance procedures that should be in place for both students and employees that are the victims of these crimes. So Abby, if you could just forward. So we'll get into our first category here. Thank you so much, Abby, for being my forwarder. So like I mentioned, this first category is going to include a couple of questions that we commonly receive around the newly included offenses, so dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, and then our bias category inclusion. So for example, we started to touch on this earlier. I live in a state that counts 2 people living together as roommates under domestic violence laws. Should I include roommates within our domestic violence statistics? So the Department of Education has specifically spoken to how their intention was not to include roommates under that domestic violence definition. However, the final part of the definition of domestic violence states what you see here on your screen, which indicates that anyone in your state that is captured under domestic violence laws would be included as a domestic violence crime. So you have 2 strategies that you can take. One is you can consistently include the definition of your state, so include roommates within your counting of domestic violence crimes, or you can consistently exclude, pointing to what the department has stated in the preamble to the VAWA amendments to Clery, and then has reiterated in the most recently updated version of the handbook. And so with whichever method you choose, as long as you are applying that thinking consistently and then documenting your decision making around that. So just to give a small example, so if there is a crime of violence between 2 roommates in a state where roommates are captured under your domestic violence definition, you have the choice to include that situation or that incident as a domestic violence concern, or you do not have to include that incident as a domestic violence concern. And again, this really is only applying for states that have roommates captured under that domestic violence definition. So if you have any questions around that, we would be happy to answer them, but we also recognize that this is a state-specific question, so we might say that we would answer those more easily on a one-on-one basis. But that is a common question we are getting. And then now I'm going back over to Abby, who is going to talk through the reporting questions that we frequently see coming through for these crimes.
Great. So one of the things that I do want to echo is that we had a webinar earlier this summer right after the handbook was released, in which we had a guest from the Department of Education, James Moore, who heads up the Clery Act compliance team, and he was really talking about his lens related to a lot of these different questions that are coming up. So if you didn't get the opportunity to listen to that webinar, I'd really encourage you to go back. Again, it's available for free on our YouTube page. It's really interesting and helpful to hear the perspective coming directly from the Department of Education. I also want to mention that even though today's webinar isn't focused specifically just on the intersection of Title IX and Clery, we do have our final webinar for National Campus Safety Awareness Month tomorrow that is centered on that topic. So if there are things that come up today and you really want to explore them further, that might be a good avenue or resource for you. Before we move on to reporting, I want to pull in one of the questions that was submitted in advance of the webinar from a participant who talked about, one of the questions was in relation to the distinction between domestic violence and dating violence. So I know that Laura already addressed that. But the other one was, please discuss course of conduct as it's defined as 2 or more acts are required to constitute stalking. And one of the questions that they brought up in relation to a specific scenario in the handbook was a scenario in which there were off-campus incidents that were being considered as part of the 2 or more acts criteria. So one of the things that we do want to remind you is that even though stalking is a course of conduct crime and we are considering multiple incidents within that course of conduct, not every incident has to occur within Clery Act geography in order for it to meet stalking. So there could be, for example, 2 incidents that occur off campus and then another additional incident that occurs on campus, and that would be the incident that's reflected within your Clery Act statistics. So hopefully that answers the question, but if there are other things that come up in relation to that, please let us know. Another one coming in is, where can I find information about state inclusion of roommates under domestic violence reporting? So I'm wondering if there are a couple of different ways I might interpret that. One might be that you're looking to get more information related to considerations in relation to state inclusion, whether or not roommates should be reflected. So if you want to hear the language directly from Department of Ed as to framing this, then I'd encourage you to listen to the webinar that I just mentioned. If you're talking about your own state definitions and trying to determine whether or not roommates are included within your state definitions for reporting, then I'd really encourage you to reach out to law enforcement, to state coalitions for domestic violence. There are a number of different individuals and organizations near you that are really going to be useful in helping to determine that. And really knowing what those definitions are within your own jurisdiction is going to be relevant when we're looking at prevention requirements, which we'll get to in just a little later on in this webinar. Right. So our next question, and again, all these questions are really derived from common themes that we're seeing or common questions that we're getting here at the Clery Center, or questions that were submitted to us specifically in advance of the webinar. And so this one is, our state requires mandatory reporting to law enforcement. Doesn't information on the right to decline to report to law enforcement interfere with state law? So one of the requirements in terms of the information that institutions must share in relation to their own procedures is that they have to talk about that the individual, the victim, has the right to report to law enforcement, and that the institution will support and assist them in doing so, but also that that individual has the right to decline to report to law enforcement. And you see that language right there on the slide itself. What we would remind you is that this language is really intended to give the individual context as to their own choices. Here are the options that are available to you. You can determine what is going to be best for you. So you'll notice that the language, even as you review it, it's not tied specifically to institutional reporting requirements. So say, for example, you're in a state where if you learn of an incident within your role, there is a state law that requires you to automatically report to law enforcement. That doesn't interfere with the institution notifying an individual about the procedures or the options that are available to them. That said, though, that context, that information is often incredibly useful. So if you know that that's something that's going to inform or affect the person's experience when they come forward, when they report to someone on the campus, then thinking about how you integrate that or notify students, employees, members of your community about how that state law intersects or relates to some of the other information that you're including within your policies and within your annual security report is always an important thing to do. So it's really a matter of considering where and how you're going to provide additional context as to those state requirements if they are influencing campus process. The next one that we hear quite a bit at our trainings is, shouldn't law enforcement be told about every incident reported to the campus? We need to investigate. And, I identify, I recognize the concern around this so much because we know that for those of you who are working in law enforcement, you go through so much training and you spend so much time to do your jobs well, because at the end of the day, your goal is that individuals that are hurting others no longer have access or no longer able to hurt others within your community. And so that's a really, really important role and something that's incredibly necessary and needed. But we also know and we recognize that not every person, not every victim, whether it's a student or an employee, might feel comfortable reporting to law enforcement, or they might just determine that that's not an option that feels like a good option to them at that time. So there's nothing within, to kind of drill back a little bit, there's nothing within Clery Act requirements that requires an institution to initiate an investigation or disclose personally identifiable information or identifying information about the victim within public spaces. So even though law enforcement is an incredibly valuable resource and option on the campus, a lot of what we see within the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act is really creating the space for the institution to present thoroughly, accurately, thoughtfully all of the different options that are available so that victims, survivors can make the decision as to what's best for them. Now that said, though, the way, the language that we use in all of the different places that we're reporting or reflecting this is going to make a difference. So there's a very big difference in using language that's presenting different options. You have the right to do this, but you could choose to decline to report to law enforcement. There's a difference between that type of language and a language or tone that may seemingly communicate, even if that's not the intention, that might come across as communicating that someone should not report to law enforcement. So the language that you use, the way that you present it, is certainly going to be important. But again, a lot of the constructs within the Violence Against Women Act amendments to the Clery Act really go back to how are we presenting all of those options that are available so that that individual can decide what's best for them. And this kind of brings us to our next piece, which is, we've had so many individuals at training say we're very lucky at our institution that we have a lot of different resources that are available to members of our community. But then it brings us to this question of, with so many reporting options, how do we avoid confusion of roles, situations in which a survivor has to continuously retell their story, or duplication of numbers? So this is something that we're hearing a lot, especially because, as Laura mentioned, there are different individuals who are required to report for the purposes of Clery than for Title IX. There are a number of different ways and places in which information is coming into the institution. And there are a lot of helpful things about that, because what it's doing is it's creating more space to communicate, to let members of your community know that you want them to come forward and encourage a culture of reporting. Now, the concern that comes up with that, as you see kind of posed within this question, is that because there are so many options, how do we make it clear so that it doesn't come across as overwhelming or confusing? So one of the things to think about is, what are the ways that we streamline reporting options? So when we're presenting this information, is it really clear as to where the institution would like you to go to report? So we know that campus security authorities under the Clery Act and responsible employees under Title IX are all required to report. But where are the individuals or offices on campus that are best trained, best poised to support someone, to help someone if they are choosing to come forward? And how well are we communicating that to our community? Do we have a coordinated response? So recognizing that there are all these different avenues, what are the ways in which these different departments, whether we're talking about law enforcement, whether we're talking about the disciplinary process, whether we're talking about on and or off campus resources, what are the different places and ways that these individuals are working together and talking to one another so that there can be a coordinated response, so that it doesn't feel as though if I'm a victim and I go to one place on campus, I get one response, but if I had gone through this other avenue, that I have access to more options or more resources. Some of the requirements that we're going to talk about later in this webinar really speak to that as well, but really consider, take a moment, take a step back to consider, if you were a member of your community that's not within the role that you're in right now, how would I know what my reporting options are? How would I understand or know where to go? And the differences between the two different places. What we found, we're going to talk a little bit later about written notification to survivors, to students or employee victims about rights and options that are available. What we found for a lot of institutions was that putting this written explanation in place was actually really challenging, because it was the first time there were a number of these different roles all in a room figuring out, okay, how do we work together if and when this report comes in? So looking for those opportunities to really coordinate your roles in advance is going to be really, really useful. Walk through, do some case studies based on reports or things that have happened on your campus, and really consider, how might we make this more fluid? Have we gathered any feedback about what someone's experience was? And then lastly, even considering your reporting form. So if a number of different departments are using the same reporting form, is there a question on the reporting form that indicates whether or not this same incident, the same experience, has been reported to someone else on campus? Even considering how thorough, how direct, how clear your reporting forms are might help navigate this concern about multiple pieces of information coming into multiple offices on campus. And so with that in mind, we'd love to hear from you about what are some tools or practices that you currently implement on your campus to streamline reporting. So if you go into that control panel, you'll notice that questions pane that some of you have used to submit questions. Take a moment and just share with us, if you're comfortable, if there's something useful that you'd like to share. What are some of the tools or practices that you have in place that really help to address this concern or this question about how do we navigate all the different types of resources? So one of the things we have coming in is weekly meetings between police, housing, and conduct. So finding opportunities for different individuals to get in the room at the same time. There are other individuals that are really kind of speaking to the same kind of concept or idea, whether it's a sexual assault response team, a student of concern, weekly meetings. Everything goes into a master spreadsheet, so there might even be resources. Now, certainly there might be a number of different things that the institution needs to think about or consider in terms of how much information needs to be shared with multiple departments, but thinking about, are there resources, are there tools that we're using for individuals who are sharing information to keep everything streamlined. Looking at report management systems that include Title IX and Clery tracking, twice a week meetings between Title IX coordinator, judicial affairs, housing, police, and student support to talk about VAWA-related cases. Putting a tips or online anonymous reporting option in place. Sexual assault response team meets monthly. So you'll notice, and what I appreciate is that a lot of you and your responses are really talking about not just coordination if and when an incident is occurring, but rather what are we doing in advance to get these different players in the room to really talk about these different requirements and these different needs. So that's excellent. And Laura, is there anything that you would kind of add to that particular section, or anything that I missed before I move on to prevention and response?
No, the only thing I would say is we did see a couple of questions coming through around stalking that I just wanted to address because they're quick answers. One of them was, what standard is being used to determine the difference between stalking and harassment? And you answered your own question in asking it. It is that standard of would a reasonable person be experiencing the same kind of fear and distress that is expressed by the victim coming forward? So somebody coming forward and saying that they just want so-and-so to stop would not necessarily be constituted as stalking unless that person was also explaining that they were experiencing substantial fear or emotional distress. And then again, it's not in comparison to how you would also be reacting to that same information, but you are considering somebody with similar identities as that reporting individual. You're considering that as the person, because we don't want to, for you, receiving roses on your doorstep might not be distressing, but for this individual that's reporting, it might be distressing, and it might cause fear because of what that represents from their relationship, or from what else that means about where that person now knows that reporting individual lives or exists or attends class, etc. So that standard of substantial fear or emotional distress is a distinguishing factor in determining how you are recording those stalking incidents. And then there was there are a couple of other questions about specific incidents. And so we would just reiterate that we want to try to do our best to answer as many general questions as we can through today's webinar, and that we really do recommend reaching out to WESTAT for any specific guidance around how to classify a particular incident or a piece of your geography.
Great. And I'll also echo that the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting has a lot of good examples and information related to counting stalking. So looking at that particular chapter on counting and classified might be really helpful for you there as you make some of those determinations. So for this next section, we're going to be talking more, as Laura mentioned, about prevention and response, and really honing in on some of the kind of common areas that we're seeing. We do annual security report reviews with our collaborative members, and a lot of times we'll see kind of common patterns or common themes in terms of areas that institutions might need to pay more attention to, or things that they might be able to expand on. And so one of the questions in relation to that is, what is an institution's role in relation to orders of protection? So within your policy for sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, one of the things that has to be reflected is the rights of victims and the institution's responsibilities for orders of protection, no contact orders, restraining orders, or similar lawful orders issued by a criminal, civil, or tribal court, or by the institution. And again, that's within your policy, but then that's also then reflected within your annual security report policy statement. And so what we would really encourage you to go back to and look at is the handbook specifies that this is really intended to help members of your community understand what options are available to them. So within your policy statement, do you have information really breaking out what legal options are available under what circumstances? We know different states use different terminology. So a lot of times when we watch movies or television, we might hear restraining order. But in Pennsylvania, where the Clery Center is located, they use protection from abuse order. So because that terminology is different, oftentimes members of your community might not recognize that they have access to a resource because they don't necessarily know what to be looking for. And this can really help address that. So have we broken out what legal options are available and under what circumstances? How can someone get additional information or file a request? So if I am somebody who thinks that one of these resources would be useful for me or would help increase my own safety, how would I do so? And then how does the institution honor requests or comply with orders? So even recognizing what this communicates to the person is that you want them to notify the campus, even if they access this outside of the campus community, you want them to notify the campus because the campus is only able to help and support if they know that it exists. So really communicating that within your policies and within your policy statements is not only helpful, but it's certainly required under these amendments. The next one is, in providing a change in living situation, who should be required to move? So one of the things that comes up quite a bit when we're looking at Title IX and Clery is that they're really both establishing that there's a prompt, fair, and impartial process when we're looking at disciplinary proceedings. However, in addition to that, we also have elements, accommodations that are made available to victims and survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking, such as a change of housing, living, transportation, working, or other protective measures that you might put in place if they're requested by the victim. So not every person might choose or want to access them. And also if they are reasonably available, if it's something that's reasonable that the institution is able to provide. And so the handbook specifies a number of different factors when you're trying to determine or figure out what is reasonable in making those changes. So some of those are listed on the screen. So what is the complainant saying that they need? What type of support are they looking for? The age of the students involved, the severity or pervasiveness of the allegations, the continuing effect on the complainant, and a number of other different aspects that you can see on the screen there. So the handbook does specify that the institution should minimize burden on the victim, but that they do have to carefully consider the factors when making that determination. For example, different individuals might be pursuing different processes on campus. There might be one victim that doesn't want to move forward with a disciplinary process, and in making the evaluation, the institution is in a position where they can support certainly that decision. And so if that's the case, there might be limited options for making that accommodation. So making sure certainly that accommodation could still be afforded, but that may result in moving the victim or the survivor in that instance. One of the things that we always say is, or that we always go back to, is what does your policy say? Because that is really your guiding light, so to speak. That is the one thing that is guiding all of your processes on the campus. So what does your policy speak to? What is your process for if an accommodation is requested? Who is assisting that person in doing so? How are you determining what's reasonable or what's most useful? And as I mentioned, the type of request and amount of information shared may influence that process. So the nature of the case is really going to influence that. So it's not going to be a matter of you always move the complainant or you always move the respondent. It's really going to be a matter of what is it that's being requested and what is the way that we can best provide that type of resource or that type of support within our community. And that kind of also links to our next one, which is what should we do if there's an accommodations request that we cannot meet? And one of the things that I'd encourage you to think about is really a lot of times these accommodations, so changes in transportation, living, working, all of these different types of accommodations, they are really going to vary based on the situation and what that person needs initially. So what we hear on a regular basis in working with institutions is some creative problem solving in terms of the best way to implement some of these accommodations. So for example, if I am requesting an accommodation and I'm saying I want to be moved to this penthouse off campus, there is certainly going to be a line in which that may not be or is not reasonable for the campus to provide. But from what we hear, what we see in working with institutions, most of the time there is a reasonable outcome or way to find a result that is useful and that is helpful with some problem solving. So for example, we've had a number of different smaller institutions where they might only have, a particular class might only be offered in one particular location. So they really look at things like, how do we designate a schedule so that the complainant, the respondent, the two individuals do not have to be in the same space at the same time? Are there different ways? Are there resources that we have available to us, whether we're talking about Skype, whether we're talking about a way to meet a particular assignment? Are there things that we could do that might not necessarily be exactly what that person initially asked for, but that are meeting the spirit or the concern as to why they want or they need the accommodation? So consider the options that are available. Ask really thoughtful questions in terms of what the person feels as though they need or what they're looking for. Communicate if you do feel as though there's a limitation, communicate what that limitation might be or what your concerns are. But in many situations, what we hear, what we see from institutions is that they are able to come to a reasonable accommodation, but sometimes it involves thinking outside the box. So I'd really encourage you, this is an opportunity to connect with other institutions, with other folks within the campus community, and really talk to other campuses about, what are some of the different ways that you're applying a specific accommodation. And then certainly, documenting the decision that you made, why you made that decision, and really remaining thoughtful and intentional about that process. So now we're going to move on to talking a little bit more about that written notification that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So I'm going to hand it back over to Laura.
Thanks so much, Abby. So a common question we do get, which I really appreciate from institutions, because this is a prime example of how you are thinking about the spirit of these requirements and not just the letter of the law, but it is, what should we do if this written notification creates a safety risk for the survivor? So meaning, how do we make sure that this written notification is something that doesn't identify to perhaps a survivor's partner or friends or anybody that they are unwilling yet to share with that they are the victim of such abuse? And what if that even means that it's putting them in a more risky situation because their abuser in their life has become aware of the fact that they are maybe seeking out support or talking about what's going on with somebody else? So we have a couple of different answers to that. One of them is, this is one of the very reasons why the written explanation of rights and resources is a requirement for institutions to give to all students and employees annually in writing, so that it is a common practice at your institution that you are talking about this and that you are sharing resources to all people before they are even coming forward as a victim, perhaps, so that you are eliminating that identifying factor of those resources, and also communicating to your entire campus that this is something that we aren't just talking about when in a reactive way. We are going to be proactive about it. So hopefully that measure would eliminate some of the speculation or concern that perhaps a perpetrator might have when they would see somebody with that information in their possession or in their house, apartment, etc. But on top of that, there is no specific guidance from the department as to how to mitigate the safety risk for a survivor. So we are really encouraging you all to know your own campus culture and rely on your own expertise, whether that is within your campus community, your surrounding community organization, but taking into account any tips or ideas or suggestions that you have around mitigating that risk for your survivors on your campus. But in addition to that, consider what language you're using and how you are sharing that information and how public you are making that information for and what you're even calling that information that you provide to victims, because as we all know, you don't just have to provide the written notification to all, but you also give it again to your victims when they do come forward, or your survivors when they come forward requesting to have accommodations made or asking for assistance with reporting or filing a complaint. You provide information again in writing. So what are you calling that resource? Are you providing, there's a technique that you can have on your websites where it's an immediate click out button or clicks you to the most previous search page that you had if you use it on your website. So that way, if somebody does walk by and that person is in a public place, or they just don't want somebody that is a potential perpetrator to see what they are looking at, or they just don't want anybody else to know that they are looking at that information, you can easily click on that Safe button and it'll take you immediately out of the page and to another search engine page, so that that information is kept private. So that's just a small amount of promising practices there, but we would certainly encourage you to share in this next chat box anything that you would suggest that is happening on your own campus in regards to written notification, but also sharing with us who is involved in your campus in designing the written notification that goes to victims. So if you could just take a second to respond in the chat box and answer to that question, that would be super helpful for us. We're always excited to learn. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Abby.
While they do that, I just want to jump in one of the questions that was coming in. So someone asked, you know, did I hear that you said it's a requirement to distribute to all students and employees the Notice of Rights annually? So there are a couple of different places in which written information is found under the Clery Act. One is a notice to students and employees about on and off campus resources in a number of different areas, victim advocacy, financial aid, and a number of others. And so that is something that's shared with students and employees generally, not just victims. But the written explanation of rights and options is specific to victims. However, we see institutions also making that really widely and publicly available, so that somebody might be able to access or find it or utilize it even if they choose not to come forward and share their story or their information with the campus. The only thing that I'll say kind of to Laura's point as well is that we know that every situation is different. So even though that information is shared broadly or may be shared broadly with the campus community, we know that there could still be some very serious concerns or risks that a victim or survivor might communicate for if their abuser found that information within their own material. So even though you might share broadly with the campus community, you know, we certainly want to make sure that we're listening to what the members of our community are saying, what a survivor is saying in terms of the risk that they feel or what might impact their own safety. And certainly there may be scenarios in which that person does not feel comfortable or feel as though they can safely take that information with them. Like we said, the department didn't say anything specific on that particular topic within the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting, but you may, you know, certainly consider that in terms of your documentation and whether or not that person chooses to take the information with them.
Great, thank you, Abby. And thank you all so much for all of the answers that you're sharing about who is part of your written notification development. I see a lot of great answers around your Clery compliance teams, yay, that are already in place, or your SARTs, and a lot of collaboration between your Title IX coordinator, your Dean of Students, your campus advocates, and then your marketing department and your communications offices and your student services offices, which are really, really valuable partners to make sure that you're bringing to the table, because we also want this to be a clear and easy to read document. If you even just, Abby could forward to the next slide of things to consider, a small exercise that Abby and I like to use in our trainings around creating your written notification is to think about like a public experience that you have had. I tend to use the example of the DMV. And what do you wish you knew before you walked into the DMV for the very first time? If you could receive all of that in a pamphlet or a handout or a written notification guide, what would you step by step wish you had known? And that's kind of the framework or the lens we encourage you to adopt for when you are creating your written notification. What do you wish you could have explained to a survivor before they came to seek out your services? So it could be really helpful, depending on the relationships you have with students or survivors on your campus, to include them in the development of this written notification, particularly how you might want to consider including different information in a student written notification versus an employee written notification, as we are asking for the information to be tailored to those specific groups. You don't have to, just a suggestion, but we really encourage you to be inclusive in your written notification by recognizing that you might not know all the answers. So that's why it's really important to partner with other professionals on your campus as well as other survivors, as they are professionals in the experience. So we really want to make sure that we are talking to them and getting their input on your written notification. Abby, if you could, oh, and also, sorry, the last piece with things to consider is just the contact information on that written notification. I can't tell you how often it doesn't include the hours with which you could contact certain individuals that you're naming on that form. So it would be really helpful to specify that the Title IX coordinator might only be someone that's available during business hours, and that outside of those hours, you should really be talking to public safety directly, who can still contact you with other professionals that can link you to the Title IX coordinator at some point, but just being specific around contact information in terms of office hours, email, phone numbers, and then hours of availability. That would be really helpful. But thank you, Abby.
And in your handouts, in addition to the slides, there's also not a template from the Clery Center, but just some things to think about, a way to organize information, some kind of questions and things that you might pose when you're putting together that content yourself.
Great, thank you so much for that reminder, Abby. That would have been not good to not remind them of that resource, so thank you. And then the next question that we see here is one as a typical pitfall we see institutions encountering, particularly with the inclusion of this term of information on risk reduction should be included within your annual security report policy statement in this area, but then also should be a part of your policies and procedures in responding to crimes of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. And what we really encourage you to review and reflect is the way that risk reduction is defined by the Clery Act, which is provided for you on your screen right here. But this definition almost, I mean, this might be strong to say, but it almost flies in the face of the traditional understanding of risk reduction, which in the past was how to not be a victim and or how to not be a perpetrator. And while we want to include information on how everyone can be safer or can hopefully avoid being involved in a crime, we want to make sure that when we're talking about risk reduction in the context of power-based violence crimes or gender-based violence crimes, we want to make sure that we are including this concept of risk reduction means we want to decrease perpetration and increase bystander intervention. And we want to increase the empowerment for victims in order to promote safety overall. So not just telling victims what not to do, but helping to provide resources and tips and interventions to promote the empowerment of victims for what they can do and what everybody can do to be a productive member and contributor to a safer campus. And so when you are reviewing what information you are including within your annual security report, take a chance to see if that aligns with this revised definition of risk reduction, or does it kind of revert back to the more traditional understanding of risk reduction, telling folks what not to do in order to avoid being a victim? Does it provide tips for how you can be a more positive bystander? And that doesn't necessarily mean always intervening in a very direct way, but it does mean taking part and taking ownership of your role in promoting campus safety and in expressing that it is not okay to engage in sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, or any other gender or power-based violence on your campus. And then, thank you so much, Abby, perfect, reading my mind. And then another question we get is, how does an institution show that their programs are informed by research? So you can do this in a number of ways. You can use programs that are already vetted by research. So research conducted according to the scientific standards that are explained through a lot of articles that are put out by the CDC around the effectiveness of education and programming in order to affect change. So you can either choose to use programs that have already been vetted for having efficacy through research, or you can also just include in your explanations of your program what evaluations and assessments you conduct as an institution to ensure that your programs are doing what they say they're going to do. So that would be another way that you would note that your programs are informed by research, by noting that you are pulling these standards or these practices either from organizations or programs that have already been vetted to be effective, or that you are also evaluating your effectiveness. And key questions to ask are, how are you doing this? Are we currently evaluating? Are those evaluations proving to be effective, or are those evaluations something that we need to revisit? Thank you, Abby. You can go to that next slide. And then what is the required mode of delivery for programs? There is no required mode of delivery by the Department of Education, but what they do say is that, or what we do know rather, is that multimodal programming is best. So tapping into all the various ways that individuals learn and making sure that that intervention or that dosage is happening. So it's not just a one and done program during orientation, but that it is something that's occurring throughout your academic year, years of students, whether you are a student leader or not. And I know that that's, way easier said than done, particularly because it is much easier to capture students when they are first setting foot on your campuses and don't realize yet that they can choose not to attend something, and also that it's much easier to engage with student leaders or students that are connected to a team or organization because they already have required times that they need to be present or meet. But we know that the more availability you have in all these different modes, there is a greater chance that you will reach a wider breadth of individuals. So we also want to make sure that you know that you can combine one or more of the required elements into a single training. So you don't have to just devote one training to bystander intervention and one on risk reduction and one on sexual assault and one on dating violence. You can talk about all of the crimes and all of these pieces in one program, or you can break it out, whichever you think is more effective and more sustainable for your campus. And I know we're reaching like the end of our scheduled time together, so I want to try to make sure we get through these next couple of slides because we also want to extend it to questions. So I just want to touch briefly on what suggestions we have for bystander intervention programs, particularly ones that are inclusive, culturally competent. So again, I would suggest looking at what programs already are vetted for effectiveness. You don't need to recreate the wheel always, as long as you are making sure that those programs are taking into consideration the varied components that make up your student body. And I guess I would even start with the first question of how do you determine what training programs you're bringing? Do you just make that decision independent of consulting with all students on your campus or all represented groups on your campus? Or do you have an open line of communication with individuals to ask, what do you think would be the most effective? What do you need? What do you want? And it is, on the institution to start those conversations. And again, it's not putting the burden of creating those programs on those groups, but it is asking, what is it that we can do better for your community or for your particular needs on campus as it pertains to bystander intervention. And then don't forget about the benefits that you have from your community organizations and also on campus already. Work to develop those cross-campus collaborations and ensure that you are having instructors do this work that are comfortable with this material and that are representative of the identities of students on your campus. Great. So, and just quickly, we want to take a second to ask if you have a second, can you just share some of the primary prevention programs or awareness campaigns you are implementing on your campus for your students or employees and why? And I know that's like a pretty big question, but anything that you can share would be really helpful for us to share with the greater community on the webinar today.
And while you do that, we also just wanted to share a couple of different resources because I know one of the things that someone asked is what are suggestions for bystander intervention programs as well. So there are a number of different places where you can go to see what other individuals are doing or what other programs are out there. The White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault has a website, notalone.gov, and they have a number of different reports on different types of prevention, how they've been evaluated, what other institutions are using. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center also includes quite a bit in terms of bystander intervention and what programs are available out there, highlighting things like Green Dot and Step Up and a number of other different programs that really use that as their core construct. And lastly, the Office on Violence Against Women has a website for the campus grant program, but also for the broader community, changingourcampus.org. And they also include a number of different information related to prevention. So there's a couple of places to go if you're really trying to feel out what resources are available. And all of those resources are included on the our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website. So if you were trying to write furiously and weren't able to get those down, you can go to our website and look at some of the resources that are linked there.
Thanks so much, Abby. And so I see some questions coming through. So some great examples of EverFi or Haven. I know they're always they're floating between those two names right now. Or I think it's the Haven program run through EverFi, which is for students and faculty and staff. And then One Love Foundation training, which is a really great example of talking about dating violence. It provides an extended video that walks through a story of one example of one type of dating violence, and then provides a discussion or a workshop to talk around the issues that come up through the video. Know More and It's on Us, great. And a lot of people are talking about how you're integrating all of that work into your first year programs, which is awesome. Wonderful. Okay, great. And so I'm now going to turn it over to Abby, who's going to walk through some common questions we receive around disciplinary proceedings for these crimes.
Great. And like I said, as we wrap up these final questions, we are going to stay on the line in case you have additional questions, but we are recording this, so if you do have another meeting or obligation to get to and aren't able to join us for the very tail end, you can always listen to this after the fact as well. So in terms of disciplinary proceedings, we know there are a number of different types of questions that can come up specific to your institutions. One of the ones that we see quite a bit is, what do you do if someone requests an advisor of choice that would create a conflict within the hearing process? So we know that that advisor of choice requirement really opened up what's made available to students or employees as they're a part of this process. It's something that's made available to both a complainant and respondent, or the language that Clery uses is accused and accuser. And what it means is that that advisor, that individual, is allowed to have an advisor, and the institution is not allowed to restrict who that advisor is. So that could be an attorney, that could be a parent, that could be a friend. Where this presents a challenge, there might be certainly a number of different challenges that you might face in navigating this requirement. But one of the areas that we've heard is if the person is requesting an advisor, that could create a conflict within the specific process. So one of the things that I would point to, or that I'd encourage you to consider, is that in addition to the advisor of choice option, we know that proceedings are expected to be prompt, fair, and impartial. And an aspect of that is that it has to be conducted by officials who do not have a conflict of interest or bias for or against the accuser or the accused. And so one of the things that we'd really encourage you to do, if this is the challenge that you're facing, is consider, are there alternatives? So if this individual that the person is requesting as an advisor could potentially create a conflict within our own process, is there a way that we could still implement our process and remove that individual that they're requesting as the advisor from the process so that we can keep it, continue to have it be prompt, fair, and impartial? This is something that's still pending. We haven't heard any specific guidance from the Department of Education in that area, but what we really would encourage you to center on is, are there alternatives? Are there ways in which that this person could use that individual as their advisor, and others could implement the process on our campus? A lot of that may depend on your size, your structure, how your disciplinary proceedings are structured, and we recognize that, but that would kind of be the initial starting point. And then if it gets to that point, if it gets beyond that, then you certainly would have to look at, even though the law says we cannot limit the choice of the advisor, if in this scenario we cannot have proceedings that are prompt, fair, and impartial, we're going to have to make a decision that we feel best aligns with staying to the heart of keeping our proceedings impartial. And then how do you provide a definition of consent if the state doesn't have one? So one of the reasons we included this in disciplinary proceedings is that there tends to be a lot of confusion when it comes to definitions as to where certain definitions need to be included or how they're reflected within our policies and our policy statements. So part of the prevention requirements, this is separate from the disciplinary proceeding requirements. Part of the prevention requirements include that the institution has to provide the definition of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking as those terms are defined in the applicable jurisdiction, and the definition of consent in reference to sexual activity in the applicable jurisdiction. That is not used for the purpose of reporting Clery Act statistics. It may not be the definition of consent that you even use within your disciplinary proceedings. So it's important to look at and consider how definitions vary or are structured. When it comes to your disciplinary process and that aspect of your policy, you are required to include Clery definitions. So sexual assault includes the UCR definitions for rape, fondling, incest, and statutory rape. Your policies may be broader than that, certainly, but that's something that we have to consider, as well as the definitions for dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking under the Clery Act. Now, like I said, the policy may go broader than those core Clery requirements, but that would be a basis for those proceedings. Your jurisdictional definitions are only required in relation to your prevention programs. And the reason for that is that if somebody chooses to access the criminal justice process, report to law enforcement, it's really framing so that they can understand what definitions are going to be used for those purposes, since it may be, and oftentimes is, different from how you implement your own institutional policies or definitions you use there. So you really want to consider where and how you are communicating those distinctions within your policies and within your policy statements. And then lastly, if Title IX and Clery conflict, which do you follow? If state law and Clery conflict, which do you follow? So one of the things that we would note is that oftentimes conflicts are not within the law themselves, but rather in implementation. So if you're running into a scenario on your campus in which you feel as though Title IX and Clery Act implementation is conflicting with one another, I'd encourage you to sit in on the webinar tomorrow, because we'll talk about some of this overlap and this intersection. But I'd also then go back to really looking at concretely what are the areas on our campus where we feel as though there's a conflict. And if that's true, let's go back to the source material as we look at what's required under Clery and what's required under Title IX. Do the laws themselves conflict, in which we would say that they do not? Or is the way that we're implementing our policies creating the conflict on our campus, and how can we find alternate solutions to that? A great resource is to connect with some of the national experts, and certainly those that might be within your state or even locally and other institutions, to learn best practices. So reach out to another campus and say, how are you navigating this difference? How are you navigating this scenario? We often find that those solutions are really found in those conversations. And then craft policies considering the intersections as not to create bulky or confusing processes. So even in the example earlier that I used, where say there's a particular state that requires automatic reporting to law enforcement from individuals on a campus or campus professionals, that in itself doesn't conflict with the Clery Act. However, certainly it's something that institutions have to take into consideration when they're crafting policy language, when they're communicating with the different audiences on their campus. And so the ideal, and what institutions really should do, is to consider all of those intersecting laws as they're crafting a policy. So it's not, we're crafting this for Title IX, we're crafting this for Clery, we're crafting this for state, but it's looking at how do we create overarching policies that take into considerations all of these different things that might be really specific to our campus environment or our state or our requirements, and how do we do so in a way so that we can comply with all three of them. And then we're not navigating these challenges in the moment as we're trying to respond or provide support to survivors, but rather we've had these conversations in advance on our campus. So just a couple of things to look at and consider. Typically, federal law is going to trump state law in many scenarios, but we run into few situations in which, in our Clery Act trainings, in which something that a participant communicates within their state is in conflict with Clery. Most of the time it might certainly be different. It might be an expansion of what's required under Clery, but you really want to look carefully as to whether or not it's truly a conflict or whether your implementation is creating the conflict. All right. So now we're just going to go back and make sure that if there are any questions that we missed, or if there are any questions that you have, my colleague Megan is also going to be plugging in an evaluation. So we really like to get, I know some of you are kind of lending feedback on the helpfulness of the webinar, which we already appreciate. We really love to get your feedback. We use it to inform our webinars. This entire series of FAQs webinars is really based on your feedback from prior National Campus Safety Awareness Month webinars and other things we've done with you all throughout the year. So please do, if you have some time, lend your feedback and your insight on what you liked and what you'd like to see more of, and certainly any suggestions that you might have for future changes. So one of the things a question that came in that I think might be useful for everyone is, will the resources mentioned during the webinar be made available with the recorded version of the webinar? So as we mentioned, as long as you're signed up for National Campus Safety Awareness Month, you will receive an email on Monday, as you have throughout the month, that does link to these recordings. We also update the information on the National Campus Safety Awareness Month website, and those resources that are not linked within the handout section here are also available there, as well as some of the links to other organizations and things that we've mentioned throughout the webinar. So we really encourage you to go to that National Campus Safety Awareness Month website, because that really is the hub for a lot of the information that we're talking about, and we tried to intentionally create spaces in there that would fit nicely with these webinars. Okay, so I'm going through. So one of the questions that we have, a related question for Clery definitions, we have some concerns about the word fondling. Do you have to use or define this in education program materials, or can you use non-penetrative sexual assault for everything except the annual security report? So if we're going back to the core language of Clery, the way that Clery is written is that the disciplinary proceedings are required to utilize the definitions that are referenced earlier in the law, and those definitions earlier in the law do pull directly from that language. We don't have any precedent, especially because this is the first time we've seen these definitions really pulled into disciplinary proceedings in this way. We don't have any precedent in program reviews or in language from the Department of Education as to whether or not they would use substitute language. I would say you can certainly, or if it's permissible to use substitute language, I would certainly, if that's something that you're running into on your campus, we always encourage you to reach out to the Department of Education, get some feedback, get some insight from them. And also reach out to other campuses, because we have seen some policies incorporate certainly the word fondling, but they've been able to do so in a way, especially with some of the other language that they have, really speaking to the different types and spectrum of experiences that are covered within their policy. They've been able to do so in a sensitive and thoughtful way. So it might be useful to look at other institutions and what's crafted within their policies and see if there's a way that the Clery language might be integrated into the other information that you're sharing in a way that you're more comfortable with. But in the meantime, I can't really speak on behalf of the Department of Education, because we don't work for the Department of Education, and we don't have any, examples or precedent to look for as to how they would answer that particular question.
Abby, I just saw a question earlier, and I apologize if you answered this and I just missed it, but in that case, I just want to reiterate your answer. But does written explanation include available online, or does it include email or digital pieces? And my answer to that would be yes. I mean, in writing doesn't mean on paper that it is written down. It's not just verbally communicated to individuals. Would you agree with that, Abby?
I would say that the handbook didn't communicate specifically in what format you're going to share it. So there might be, I know some institutions have been using a practice of an email, others have been using a practice of certainly a written document. I would consider, though, is what we're talking about really communicating the required information in a consolidated way. If it was an email that's just directing to a website where information is captured in a number of different places, I think that would make it a little bit more difficult for the department to really consider that as meeting the expectation. And again, certainly we don't speak on behalf of the department, and these are questions that are helpful to pose to them. But there isn't anything within the handbook that specifies that in writing has to be a physical document either.
Thanks, Abby. That is such a helpful point, that like if your email is just a link to a website, that's not meeting the need of the requirement. That's awesome. And just one other quick thing that I saw, Abby, was a question around, can we give some examples of what increasing empowerment for victims looks like in terms of risk reduction? And I would say, like, even I'm sure there are many other ways we could answer this, but even at a very basic level, like in your risk reduction tips or in your risk reduction information, are you talking about how it is okay that are you reiterating the idea of what these crimes are on your campus, where you can report, why reporting can be beneficial, why you have the choice to report or not? All of those things are captured in other requirements as well, but the idea of increasing empowerment is that knowing that your community takes promoting safety as a community responsibility and not just on the responsibility of individuals, that in and of itself increases the empowerment of victims because it allows them, or of survivors, it gives them some security and that it's not just on them to be calling for safety on their campus. And it's not just when somebody comes forward that we're talking about those things. So when you're talking about those tips, we really just want to make sure that the emphasis is not saying what you can do to avoid being a victim, but it should be tips on what to do when you see something that looks out of place on your campus, and how do you address those pieces, and what are some varied ways that you can be a positive bystander that do not, and what are ways that you can increase your own safety that don't have victim blaming language in there, such as watch what you wear or where you're walking or make sure nobody puts something in your drink. Would you add to that, Abby?
No, I would say absolutely. You know, one of the things that the handbook really highlights is that that language is not intended to be victim blaming. So empowerment for victims is really considering the opposite. How do we make sure that we're creating spaces in which they feel, victims, survivors, members of our community feel as though they're supported, you know, recognizing and reiterating that it's not their fault if someone else makes the decision to hurt them, and really encouraging all members of the community to be a part of the solution through that bystander, and removing or recognizing and giving options for removing some of the barriers that might prevent someone from standing in the way, or from, excuse me, intervening if they do see a problem. We had another question come in a little outside the scope of what we're talking about, but certainly in connection with some of the Clery Center's resources. Someone mentioned we recently did a We Don't Haze program to sorority on campus that was well received. Are we free to offer that on our website and give those programs just using the guides available online? So that's an additional resource from the Clery Center. We have a number of free videos, one on off-campus fire safety, and the one that you mentioned, We Don't Haze, is on hazing and how bystanders can be a part of the solution in relation to hazing, and helping to recognize what it is. So those resources are available for free. You are free and welcome to utilize those and the additional guides and resources available to implement programs on your campus. So yes, absolutely, and all of that is linked to the National Campus Safety Awareness Month website as well, for you to easily access and use. Another question that came in a little bit outside, but do want to reiterate because we know that the annual security report distribution is coming up at the end of this week, so I think it's still useful or helpful. To make sure I understand about distribution of the ASR, an email which contains a link to the ASR is not suitable for a distribution method. So you are permitted for your current students and employees to distribute the annual security report using an email linking to the ASR. However, if you are linking, it does need to link to one comprehensive document. So it can't be linking to a website in which information is captured in different places. It has to be that I click on that link, and when I click on that link, it goes directly to the complete comprehensive report with all of the required elements. If you still have questions about that, I'd really encourage you to look at our webinar that we did the first week of September that really focused on the annual security report and common questions around that. Laura, are there any other ones that I might have missed that you saw come through?
No,
and again, we appreciate your patience because we know that there were over 900 people registered for this. If there were any that got buried, please do let us know.
Abby, no, I don't see any other questions at this point, so I think it is safe to move into wrapping up.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you all for taking the time to join us. Laura, is there any kind of wrap-up information that you wanted to share before we move into closing?
No, I was just going to go do the programs and resources slide, but I think you were about to do the same thing, so you can go right ahead and do that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today. And as we mentioned, if there were any questions that you had shared a little bit earlier, if anything got buried in our questions pane over here, please do let us know and we'll be sure to address that. This webinar was just one of several webinars for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. In your control panel, you'll see that evaluation for the webinar, and we'd really appreciate if you take a few short minutes to share your thoughts and your feedback. We'd really like to know more about what you'd like to see more of. The webinar recording, this is another question that we saw come in. The webinar recording will be included in next week's National Campus Safety actually this Friday is National Campus Safety Awareness Month email blast, since we are at the end of the month, and will be available on the Clery Center's YouTube page and National Campus Safety Awareness Month website. You can click on the links in the control panel to register for the last webinar, which is tomorrow, and sign up to receive those National Campus Safety Awareness Month emails. Although there's only one more for the month, it certainly links you to that website that we talked about where all of these resources are housed. We also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle for daily campus safety information, and we appreciate all of you that have been sharing our posts throughout the month and have been creating resources of your own. We love to see all of the work that you're doing. And you can visit our website to learn more about our other training opportunities, some of which are listed on the screen here, including our Clery Center Collaborative Program, which is a team-based learning membership program that brings together colleges and universities to build sustainable approaches to campus safety and Clery Act compliance. We've been so fortunate to have so many of you join us for these webinars throughout the month. We've seen a lot of collaboration even in registration for these webinars, a number of different people from the same team all joining together, and that's really the spirit and the goal of all of the work that we do here at the Clery Center. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us using the email address info@clerycenter.org. We created this space so that you could ask questions, but we know that those come up not just during the month of September, but throughout the year. So please do connect with us, reach out to us. We want to be able to help and support you as much as possible. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you all have a great day.